You probably believe you think freely, that your opinions arrived after careful reasoning, that your choices were weighed and measured in the quiet courtroom of your mind. But most thoughts do not enter through the front door. They slip in earlier. Through childhood conversations, through the tone of a teacher's voice, through the unexamined mood of the crowd you grew up inside. By the time you call an idea mine, it is often already old. We imagine thinking as something clean and deliberate, like arranging objects on a table. Yet much of what happens in the mind is closer to weather, currents moving beneath awareness, habits repeating themselves in new disguises. You can watch this in yourself. Notice how quickly a conclusion appears when a topic touches something personal. How the body tightens before any evidence is weighed. How certainty often arrives first and reasons are gathered later to defend it. This is not stupidity. It is design. The human mind was not built primarily for truth. It was built for survival, for belonging, for reducing fear. Clarity is optional. Comfort is urgent. And so we inherit most of what we call thinking the way we inherit an accent, without noticing it happened. Critical thinking, then, is not simply a skill you learn. It is a disturbance. A small rebellion against the automatic life of the mind. To think clearly is to interrupt something ancient. The smooth machinery that prefers agreement to accuracy, certainty to curiosity, identity to understanding. Before methods and techniques, there is a more uncomfortable question. What if the greatest obstacle to thinking is not ignorance, but the quiet emotional need to remain the same? The brain loves shortcuts. Neuroscience describes it as efficiency, patterns hardened to save energy, pathways repeated until they feel like truth. But efficiency has a shadow. What is familiar begins to feel correct simply because it is familiar. You see a headline and already know what you think. You meet a stranger and a story forms before they speak. The mind guesses first and calls it understanding later. This is cognitive ease. The pleasant sensation of not having to struggle. And the mind confuses that comfort with intelligence. Real thinking, however, is rarely pleasant. It is slow, uncertain, faintly embarrassing. It requires admitting that the first reaction was only a reflex. From childhood we are trained toward agreement. Good students repeat the expected answer. Good children mirror the family script. Belonging arrives as a reward for resemblance. By adulthood these lessons live inside us as invisible rules. Do not question what keeps you safe. Do not examine what gives you a place. Do not look too closely at the stories that introduced you to yourself. So the mind learns a subtle trick. It treats doubt as danger. When a belief is challenged, the nervous system responds before the intellect can speak. A quick heat in the chest, a tightening behind the eyes. We experience contradiction the way the body experiences cold, as something to escape. This is why arguments rarely change minds. Facts arrive like visitors and find the doors already locked. We imagine ourselves as rational creatures who occasionally feel. In truth, we are emotional creatures who occasionally reason. Even the phrase, "I changed my mind," is misleading. Most of the time the mind changes us, steering perception toward whatever protects the story we are already living inside. Notice how easily you forgive evidence when it flatters a belief you love. Notice how fiercely you interrogate the same evidence when it threatens that belief. The standard is not logic. The standard is comfort. And comfort is a powerful editor. It trims complexity, removes inconvenient details, smooths contradictions. Until the world fits the shape of our expectations. We call the result common sense. Often it is only common habit. None of this means thinking is impossible. It means that thinking is unnatural. A fragile act performed against the grain of instinct. To think critically is to pause between feeling and conclusion, to stand in the narrow space where identity loosens its grip. Most people never enter that space for long. Not because they are incapable, but because the cost is emotional rather than intellectual. The mind prefers a familiar error to an unfamiliar truth. And so the first lesson of critical thinking is not a technique at all. It is a recognition you are not beginning from neutrality. You are beginning from a story that has been rehearsed for years. Only when that is seen clearly does genuine thinking become possible, not as a weapon to win debates, but as a quiet willingness to be wrong before you are right. We like to imagine doubt as a polite visitor, a reasonable question sitting calmly at the table. In reality, it arrives more like a storm. It unsettles the furniture of the mind, lifts the floorboards you were standing on, asks you to live for a while without the shelter of certainty. To question an idea is often to question a version of yourself. Beliefs are not cold objects. They are woven into memory, into the voice of a parent, into the years you spent building a life around them, into the fragile architecture of who you believe you are. When a belief trembles, something in the body trembles with it. This is why doubt rarely feels noble. It feels like loss before it feels like growth. Like betrayal before it feels like honesty. You see it when someone begins to outgrow the story that once guided them. The career that promised meaning now tastes faintly hollow. The relationship built on familiar roles starts to feel like a costume. The ideology that offered clear enemies suddenly looks small and frightened. None of these changes begin as ideas. They begin as discomfort, a quiet sense that the shape of your life no longer fits the shape of your inner weather. Psychology calls this cognitive dissonance, the pain of holding two truths at once. But the textbooks rarely describe how intimate that pain is. It can feel like disloyalty to the person you have been. Like erasing photographs from your own history. Like admitting that years were spent serving a map that led nowhere. So the mind bargains. It searches for smaller explanations. Bad luck, a temporary mood, someone else to blame. Anything except the possibility that the foundation itself is cracked. We defend beliefs the way we defend old friendships, even when they have begun to wound us. Have you noticed how people become most certain at the exact moment their certainty is weakest? Anger rises to guard what fear cannot explain. Laughter appears to disguise confusion. Sarcasm becomes a wall around a question that feels too dangerous to ask. The emotional system moves faster than thought. It presses the emergency button long before reason has finished speaking. And beneath all of it lies a simpler terror: if this belief is not true, who am I without it? Identity is a delicate construction. We spend years arranging pieces. Profession, values, memories, opinions. Until they resemble a person we can recognize. Doubt threatens to rearrange the whole gallery. This is why real thinking often begins in loneliness. The moment you allow a question to live inside you, you step slightly outside the crowd that once answered on your behalf. Even when no one is watching, the mind remembers the price of difference. It anticipates the raised eyebrows, the awkward family dinner, the quiet distance of friends who preferred the older version of you. Belonging is older than reason. For most of human history, to disagree with a group was not an intellectual adventure but a risk to survival. That ancient memory still breathes inside the modern nervous system. So the psyche offers a bargain: stay certain, and you can stay warm. Stay doubtful, and you may have to build a new home. No wonder many people choose certainty even when it makes them smaller. Yet something in us continues to ask. Late at night, when the roles of the day have loosened, a quieter voice wonders why the victories feel so thin, why the answers sound rehearsed, why the life that looks correct does not feel alive. This is the secret dignity of doubt. It refuses to let comfort pretend to be truth forever, but it asks a high price. It asks for patience with confusion, for compassion toward the self that is changing, for the courage to live temporarily without a finished story. Most of all, it asks that you tolerate being misunderstood. Even by the person you used to be. There is no technique that removes this cost. No checklist that makes transformation painless. Critical thinking is not a neutral tool, it is an emotional passage. You do not simply revise ideas. You slowly revise a life. And perhaps this is why so many intelligent people avoid it. Not because they lack the ability, but because they sense what clarity will demand. To see differently is to become differently. The mind knows this long before the intellect admits it. So it hesitates at the threshold, counting what might be lost. Yet on the other side of that hesitation waits a strange possibility that the self you discover beyond borrowed certainties may be wider than the one you were protecting so carefully. Ideas do not live only in minds. They live in relationships. Every belief is also a bridge. To a family, a community, a nation, to the small circle that taught you what a normal person is supposed to think. This is why changing your mind can feel less like an intellectual event, and more like leaving a country without knowing the new language. We speak of opinions as if they were private property. In truth, they are often membership cards. To question a shared belief is to risk the warmth of the shared fire. Even gentle disagreement can sound like betrayal to those who built their identity around agreement. Watch what happens in a room when someone asks an honest question that has no easy answer. The air tightens. Jokes arrive to restore order. Someone changes the subject in the name of keeping peace. Peace, in many groups, means protecting the familiar story from the disturbance of thought. From childhood we learn to read the invisible borders. Which topics are safe? Which doubts are impolite? Which truths must be whispered or never spoken at all? By the time we call ourselves adults, these borders feel like common sense. But they are social habits disguised as reality. This is why clarity often travels alone at first. The one who notices a contradiction rarely receives applause. More often they receive concern. Why are you overthinking? Why can't you just enjoy things? Who put these strange ideas in your head? Such questions are not cruel by design. They are guardians of stability. Every system, family, workplace, culture, depends on a certain amount of unexamined agreement to keep moving. The person who thinks too clearly slows the machinery. And machinery does not love being slowed. Consider how quickly groups reward loyalty and how reluctantly they reward accuracy. The employee who repeats the company myth is called a team player. The one who points to cracks in the myth is called negative. The friend who mirrors your outrage is trusted. The friend who asks whether the outrage is justified is exhausting. We do not only inherit beliefs, we inherit the unspoken rule that belonging matters more than precision. None of this requires a villain. It is simply the gravity of social life. Human beings are wired to synchronize with one another. In laughter, in fear, in certainty. To think differently is to step slightly out of rhythm, and the body experiences that step as a small form of exile. So many people learn a quiet strategy to keep two minds. One for the inner room where doubts are allowed to breathe. Another for the public stage where the expected lines are spoken. This division can last years. You hear someone repeat an opinion you know they do not fully believe, and you recognize the tone because you have used it yourself. It is the voice of social survival. The price is subtle, but it accumulates. A person who hides their real thinking slowly stops hearing it clearly. The unspoken self becomes a stranger, and conversation turns into performance. We call this maturity. Often it is only fatigue. Yet history moves because a few people accept the cost of seeing. They are rarely the loudest voices. More often they are the hesitant ones. The student who asks a careful question, the worker who names an obvious problem, the friend who refuses to laugh at a convenient lie. At first they look like obstacles. Later they look like beginnings. Every change we now consider normal started as a social inconvenience. Someone had to endure the awkward silence after saying what others preferred not to hear. Someone had to be briefly alone so that a clearer conversation could exist. This does not make solitude easy. It only makes it meaningful. Critical thinking, then, is not merely an internal discipline. It is a social risk. To see clearly is to negotiate constantly between honesty and connection, between the desire to belong and the desire to be real. Most days we choose a compromise. But even a small crack in the compromise lets in new air. The question is not whether there will be a price. There always is. The question is whether the cost of clarity is greater than the cost of pretending not to see. Many discover, slowly, that the heavier burden is carrying an inherited mind that never became their own. And in that discovery a different kind of courage forms. quieter than rebellion, more patient than argument. The courage simply to look at the world as it is, and to remain in it honestly, even when the crowd looks away. If the mind were only a tool for truth, we would change easily. One good argument would be enough. One clear statistic would rearrange a life. But the mind is not only a seeker. It is also a guard. Long before it learned to reason, it learned to protect. Psychologists call these protections defenses. Older traditions called them illusions. Whatever the name, their purpose is the same: to keep the inner world stable, even when reality is not. Consider how gently the mind edits experience. You remember the compliment and soften the criticism. You recall your good intentions and forget the harm that followed. Memory is less a photograph than a loyal storyteller trying to keep the main character innocent. This is not weakness. It is architecture. Without some distortion, a person might collapse under the raw weight of contradiction. So the mind builds shelters. Rationalization is one of the oldest. After every mistake, it arrives like a lawyer, with carefully prepared explanations. I had no choice. Anyone would have done the same. The situation forced my hand. The story changes, but the verdict remains, not guilty. Projection works more quietly. The anger you cannot tolerate in yourself appears suddenly on the face of a stranger. The selfishness you fear is discovered in a partner, a neighbor, a rival. It is easier to fight a trait when it wears someone else's name. Denial is simpler still. What hurts too much to hold is declared non-existent. The diagnosis, the betrayal, the slow end of a dream. The mind places a thin curtain over them and calls the curtain peace. For a time it even feels like peace. These defenses are not villains. They are emergency bridges, built during inner floods. The problem begins when the flood is over and we continue living on the bridge, afraid to touch solid ground again. Critical thinking meets its greatest opponent not in bad information, but in good defenses. You can present a person with evidence as bright as noon, and the mind will still search for a familiar shadow to stand in. Because accepting a new truth often requires mourning an old self. To admit I was wrong is sometimes to admit that years were built on fragile ground. Few transformations are purely logical. Most are emotional funerals. This is why arguments rarely change people. Arguments speak to reason. Defenses answer from fear. The mind asks, beneath every debate, if I accept this, who will I become? Who will I lose? What story about myself must die? Until those questions feel safe, no amount of proof is enough. Even intelligence can become a defense. The clever person learns to defeat any fact with a sharper theory, to hide uncertainty beneath eloquence. Words become armor. Complexity becomes a wall. You can win every discussion and still be hiding from a single truth. Yet defenses have a secret weakness: they are exhausting. To maintain a false picture of the world requires constant inner labor. Ignoring certain memories, avoiding certain conversations, explaining away certain feelings. The body pays the bill. Tension in the shoulders. Irritation with innocent questions. A quiet loneliness no achievement seems to touch. These are not signs of failure. They are signals from a deeper intelligence asking for honesty. Real thinking begins not when defenses are attacked, but when they are thanked and gently lowered. You do not shame a guard into opening a gate. You show the guard that the war has ended. This is the slow art of maturity. Learning to feel safe enough to be wrong. To meet new information without immediately asking how it threatens your identity. To treat confusion as a doorway rather than an insult. Every mind has a border where knowledge turns into self-protection. Beyond that border, facts sound like enemies and questions feel like knives. Growth happens at that exact line. Not through violence against the self, but through patient curiosity. What am I protecting right now? Which story would break if this were true? Who would I be without this familiar explanation? Such questions do not destroy the mind. They widen it. And slowly the defenses relax from stone walls into open windows. You begin to notice that reality is not trying to humiliate you. It is trying to meet you. The world becomes less a courtroom and more a conversation. This does not end vulnerability. Nothing human can. But it replaces the old reflex of guarding every belief with a calmer reflex. The willingness to see first and decide later. And in that small change, thinking stops being a battle and becomes what it was meant to be. A way of coming home to what is real. Most of our thinking happens at the speed of reflex. A headline appears and an opinion arrives fully dressed. A tone in someone's voice shifts and the body decides before the sentence ends. We call this instinct. Often it is only habit wearing a disguise. The mind prefers quick roads. They cost less energy and lead to familiar destinations. But the quickest route is rarely the truest one. To think critically is first to notice the rush. The small internal shove that wants an answer immediately. Slow thinking begins with a simple rebellion, not yet agreeing, not yet rejecting, not yet turning a feeling into a conclusion. Between stimulus and certainty, there is a narrow field of silence. Most people cross it without looking. Everything important happens there. In that pause, you can watch the mind assemble its story. Which memories it recruits, which fears it consults, which loyalties it tries to protect. The goal is not to stop this machinery, but to see it clearly enough. Not to be carried away. Slowness is not laziness. It is a different kind of accuracy. Consider how easily language pushes you. Certain words arrive already loaded: success, failure, normal, dangerous, them. Before you examine an idea, the vocabulary has framed the verdict. To think slowly is to reopen those frames, to ask what each word is hiding beneath its polished surface. Even facts require patience. A number feels solid, yet it stands on invisible assumptions. A study sounds final, yet it speaks from a narrow angle of the world. Quick thinking collects answers. Slow thinking collects contexts. This discipline feels unnatural at first. The culture around you moves at speed, feeds that refresh by the second, debates that reward the fastest reply, lives measured in immediate reactions. To slow down is almost impolite. But the mind that never rests cannot truly understand. It can only echo. Real comprehension resembles listening more than arguing. You let an idea finish speaking before preparing your defense. You allow two opposite thoughts to remain in the room together, without forcing a winner. This is harder than it sounds. Ambiguity makes the nervous system itch. Certainty feels like relief even when it is false, so slow thinking becomes a form of emotional training. Learning to stay with the discomfort of not knowing. You begin with small experiments. Reading an article without checking who wrote it first. Hearing a claim without instantly sorting it into ally or enemy. Asking, quietly, what would have to be true for this to make sense? Such questions open space where intelligence can breathe. Mistakes become visible here. The mind loves patterns so much it invents them. It connects two events and calls the connection destiny. It meets one example and pronounces a law. Speed encourages these illusions. Slowness reveals their seams. Even conversation changes. Instead of waiting for your turn to speak, you begin to wonder what the other person is protecting, what experience taught them this certainty. Understanding grows less dramatic and more humane. None of this guarantees correctness. Slow thinking can still be wrong. Its gift is different, it makes error gentle enough to be discovered. Over time a new rhythm forms. You feel the old impulse to judge instantly, and beside it a newer muscle. The capacity to wait. The world becomes less a courtroom and more a landscape you are learning to walk through. This does not remove urgency from life. Some moments demand speed. But even then a small inner observer remains awake, watching the choice unfold. To think slowly is not to abandon action. It is to act without lying about how little you know. And something unexpected follows, you begin to trust yourself more. Not because you are always right, but because you are no longer pretending that certainty is easy. The mind grows quieter, less interested in winning, more interested in seeing. In that quiet, curiosity returns. The forgotten pleasure of meeting reality without armor. Slow thinking is not a technique so much as a relationship with the present moment. You stand beside your own thoughts instead of underneath them. And from that posture, the world looks different. Less like a problem to be solved at once, more like a conversation that can unfold in time. At some point the question shifts from how to think to who is doing the thinking. Ideas do not change themselves. People do. And people change slowly, often against their own resistance, like seasons arguing with the calendar. To become someone who can change is first to accept an uncomfortable fact: you are not only a mind collecting truths. You are a story protecting itself. Every belief you hold is tied to a version of you. The loyal child, the competent adult, the person who wants to be good, the person afraid of being small. When a belief trembles, an identity trembles with it. This is why transformation feels less like learning and more like rearranging a house while still living inside it. Rooms you depended on disappear. New doors open to places you never planned to enter. Most people avoid this movement, not because they hate truth, but because they fear homelessness. The self prefers a familiar prison to an unfamiliar freedom. Yet life insists on revisions. You meet and experience your old explanations cannot carry. A failure that ignores your theories, a love that contradicts your rules, a piece of evidence that will not be politely forgotten. In that moment, you stand at a quiet crossroads: defend who you were, or risk becoming someone new. The first path is comfortable and endlessly expensive. The second is frightening and strangely alive. Becoming a person who can change requires a rare form of humility. Not the performance of modesty, but the private admission that you are unfinished. Unfinished in your politics, your relationships, your understanding of yourself. This humility is not self-hatred. It is curiosity with manners. You begin to treat your opinions like visitors rather than owners. You let them stay, but you no longer give them the keys. Listening becomes more important than being consistent. You notice how often the need to appear stable has kept you brittle. Change also demands memory. Not the sentimental kind that flatters the past, but the honest memory of how many certainties have already died quietly in you. The things you once swore by. The friendships, the judgments, the stories about how the world works. So many of them have faded without destroying your life. You survived every earlier version of being wrong. This becomes a subtle courage, evidence that you can survive again. A person who can change develops a different relationship with mistakes. Error stops being a verdict and becomes a direction. You learn to say, without drama, "I thought this was true. Now I see something else." Such sentences sound simple. They are revolutions of character. They loosen the knot between worth and certainty. They allow you to meet reality without arriving armed. Of course, change has limits. No one becomes endlessly fluid. We all carry cores. Values that feel like bedrock, loyalties older than reasoning, but even these can be held gently, like compasses rather than cages. The goal is not to become weightless, believing nothing, but to become mobile. Able to walk toward better light when it appears. This mobility alters relationships. You stop asking people to remain frozen so that you can feel safe. Disagreement becomes less personal. Conversation becomes possible again. And inside, a quieter shift occurs. You begin to like the person who is capable of learning more than the person who is always correct. Such liking is a form of peace. It does not arrive as fireworks. It arrives as room to breathe. One day you notice that a new idea can visit without causing a civil war in you. You can hold it beside the old one and let them speak. This is the real measure of maturity. Not confidence without cracks, but flexibility without collapse. To become a person who can change is finally to trust life more than your map of life. You admit that the map was drawn by a younger traveler with limited roads and older fears. The landscape has been larger all along. And so the question that once sounded dangerous begins to sound like an invitation: who might I become if I stopped guarding the old story and started listening to what is real? No technique answers this. No formula guarantees it. There is only a daily decision. To meet the next fact honestly, to meet the next person curiously, to meet the next version of yourself with a little mercy. From these small acts, a different character grows. Not heroic, not flawless, simply awake enough to change when change arrives. There is a moment that comes after all the questions and all the careful observations, when the mind finally exhales. It is the quiet freedom of not knowing. We spend so much of our lives trying to measure, to define, to prove. We chase clarity as though it were a finish line. We hoard certainty as if it could protect us from the vast, unpredictable world. But the deepest truths rarely arrive fully formed. They arrive as whispers, as hesitation, as subtle openings in the routines of our minds. To embrace not knowing is not weakness. It is the point at which real awareness begins. Here, the mind loosens its armor. The subconscious no longer needs to defend. The old reflexes of fear and habit soften their grip. The social masks you have worn for decades become lighter, as if finally allowed to rest. You realize that most of life is not about solving but about attending. The child you once were, the one who learned in silence, still exists beneath the layers of armor. She does not need instructions. She only needs to be noticed. You breathe for her, you listen for her, and in that attention, a small miracle occurs. She begins to guide the adult. Without shouting, without force. The mind that once moved at a frantic pace learns the rhythm of patience. Each thought is treated like a guest, invited in, acknowledged, then allowed to leave without judgment. This is the paradox of intelligence: the more you know, the more you discover what you do not know. Yet this is not despair. It is a kind of liberation. To stop pretending you have the answers frees you from the weight of performance. You no longer compete with ideas or with other people's expectations. You do not need to be right. You only need to be present. Presence carries a quiet dignity. It is the space between stimulus and reaction, between fear and certainty, between expectation and reality. It is here that creativity blooms, not from the mind that insists on knowing, but from the mind that allows itself to wonder. To wonder is to live. Even the act of questioning, even the hesitation, is a kind of courage. It says, I am willing to meet the world as it is, not as I wish it to be. And in that space, change becomes possible. You are no longer bound by the stories of the past, nor trapped by the projections of others. You are neither prisoner nor ruler of your own mind. You are a witness, a participant, a traveler on a path that is always unfolding. The social cost, the emotional toll, the defenses of the mind, they are still present. They will not vanish entirely, but they lose their tyranny when observed. You see them clearly, and in seeing, you are free. Freedom does not arrive as a shout. It arrives as a whisper, the simple acknowledgement that the self is not fixed, that thoughts are not commands, that beliefs are not chains. The mind can rest in uncertainty and still move with intention. The heart can hold both sorrow and joy, without collapsing under either. And the body can act without believing it fully understands. This is the subtle art of living consciously, to navigate complexity without panic, to observe without clinging, to know without needing to dominate. In this way, knowledge becomes companion, not master. Experience becomes teacher, not tyrant. The self becomes a home, not a fortress. The quiet freedom of not knowing is not empty. It is full of possibilities. It is the soil where reflection grows, where insight takes root, where life, in all its unpredictability, can be met without fear. So when the next thought arises that seems too big, too fast, too certain, pause. Notice it. Breathe. Let it pass without judgment. Let it teach you the patience you forgot you had. And if a question returns that you cannot answer, do not rush to resolve it. Sit with it. Allow it to shape your awareness. The discomfort is not a signal of failure. It is the pulse of life itself, reminding you that you are awake, that you are present, that you are learning, you are not behind. You are not lost. You are exactly where you are meant to be, in the tension between what you know and what you have yet to discover. There is humility here, and there is grace. There is a quiet joy that arrives without fanfare, that does not demand recognition. It is the reward of presence itself. And so the journey continues. Not toward certainty, not toward mastery, not toward a final answer. It continues into the subtle, the unknown, the quietly infinite depths of your own mind, to meet your thoughts without fear, to observe your feelings without judgment, to hold your own identity lightly. This is the path of awakening, the quiet freedom of not knowing, and the most intimate form of being alive. If this video made you pause and see a pattern in your own thinking, comment "I see it."